let's move along with our program. First of all, a brief introduction.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan Donahue. I'm currently a postdoctoral scholar in the lab of Kyriakos Athanasiou at UC Irvine. Dr. Athanasiou really wanted to be here today, but couldn't because both he and his wife ended up being COVID positive. He asked me to read a brief introduction of our next presenter. The next presentation is about a study of the TMJ disc complex from our group at UC Irvine, and the presenter is Eston Kallins. Eston is a high school junior, who has been working with our group for the past 2 years. Since 1989, when Dr. Athanasiou became a faculty member, Mr. Kallins is the first and only high school student from our group presenting at a scientific conference. He has worked with us exceptionally well, comprehensively, and productively. In addition to his presentation today, Eston has also recently become author on a full-size paper in Tissue Engineering Part A as a co-first author with myself. Both Dr. Athanasiou and I are particularly proud of him for these accomplishments, so please welcome him for his talk.
I could be your grandfather.
Easy. All right, thank you. Can you hear me well from here? Is that better? Good.
Great.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the nice introduction, Ryan. I appreciate that. And as he stated, I worked with Ryan and Dr. Athanasiou and Dr. Jerry Hugh to produce this study, which is titled Identifying Structure-Function Relationships Toward Tissue Engineering of the Temporomandibular Joint Disc Complex in the UPenn Mini Pig. Oh boy. All right. So firstly, as you all know well, the temporomandibular joint is a gangliomo-arthrodial joint that functions in speaking, chewing, and breathing. And you can see the joint depicted below here. In between, it includes the mandibular condyle, the glenoid fossa, and the TMJ disc complex. And we characterize the TMJ disc complex as the disc plus its 6 attachments, the lateral, medial, and posterior and anterior attachments, which include a superior and inferior aspect. And as you all know, the TMJ disc complex is central to the function of the joint as a whole, as it distributes the compressive stresses that the disc meets from the condyle into tensile stresses during articulation. And I will mention as well that the UPenn Mini Pig, which we used in this study, has emerged as a leading option for modeling the human TMJ due to anatomic and physiologic similarities with the human model. So firstly, in terms of epidemiology, just a quick introduction, which you're all familiar with. The TMJ disc complex is central to arthrogenous TMJ afflictions. TMJ afflictions constitute about 5 to 25%, they show symptoms of 5 to 25% of the population. And up to 70% of these symptoms include disc displacement, so it's very prevalent. The majority of disc displacements occur in the anterior direction, which implicates the role of the posterior attachments. And 10 to 15% of all disc displacements result in perforation of the disc, and the majority of perforations from anterior disc displacement occur in the lateral third of the TMJ disc. So as you all know, treatments for arthrogenous TMJ afflictions are either palliative or lack long-term efficacy. That was well introduced in the really nice presentations preceding me, and that's motivated tissue engineering as a potential long-term regenerative solution. So firstly, I want to introduce the tissue engineering paradigm in our lab. It begins with characterizing native tissues to establish gold standard design criteria, generating constructs with appropriate functional properties in vitro, evaluating constructs using histological, biochemical, and mechanical tests. These first 3 steps are iterative until a construct with adequate values for implementation into a defect model has been achieved, in which case we implement our constructs and examine healing using the previously characterized large animal model. So this process has been successfully completed in the TMJ disc. However, we're still in the early stages of characterizing for the TMJ disc attachments. And hence, given the epidemiology of disc displacements and perforations, the aim of this study specifically is to characterize the differences among the posterior inferior attachment, posterior superior attachment, and lateral disc in skeletally mature Yucatan mini pigs, so that we may define design criteria for tissue engineering of the TMJ disc complex as a whole. So in terms of study design, we use tissue from 8 skeletally mature Yucatan mini pigs, 4 male and 4 female, in fresh froze joints prior to dissection. We characterize our samples using histology, including H&E, picoserous red and saffron and O, polarized light microscopy for anisotropy with picoserous red stain, uniaxial tensile testing, including anterior, posterior, and medial lateral directions, photometric biochemical testing, including dimethylmethylene blue and hydroxyproline assays for glycosaminoglycan and total collagen contents, and then also mass spectrometry cross-links assay as well. So firstly, when looking at histology, you'll notice that all 3 tissues have varying degrees of heterogeneity. The posterior superior attachment specifically has the highest proportion of fat vacuoles compared to the other 2 tissues, and the lateral disc, as would be expected from previous characterization studies, has virtually no fat vacuoles. And then you'll notice through the polarized light microscopy, that the polarized light microscopy indicates the very anterior posterior alignment of the lateral disc, and then we see in the posterior superior and posterior inferior attachments a very medial lateral alignment of the tissues. And then similar intensities of picoserous red here in fibrous areas denote similar degrees of collagen in fibrous areas, and then similarly low intensities of saffron and O with fast green stains in fibrous areas here denote low glycosaminoglycan levels throughout all 3 tissues as well. And then looking at our uniaxial tensile testing results, so we measured 5 outcomes: Young's modulus, ultimate tensile strength, strain failure, toughness, and resilience. And we measured each of our 3 tissues in both the anterior, posterior, and medial lateral directions and compared. So firstly, we noticed that the lateral disc is 7.74 times stiffer, 6.12 times stronger, 3.73 times tougher, and 4.19 times more resilient in the anterior posterior direction than the medial lateral direction. You can visibly see that difference between the bars there. And then looking at the posterior inferior attachment, it is 2.78 times stiffer and 2.2 times stronger in the medial lateral direction compared to the anterior posterior direction. And that also agrees with the polarized light microscopy you saw in histology. And then when comparing the posterior inferior attachment to the posterior superior attachment, the inferior attachment is 2.13 times stiffer, 2.3 times stronger, and also trends higher in resilience and toughness. So that supports this notion of function, that the posterior inferior attachment anchors the disc to the condyle, while the posterior superior attachment allows translation over the articular eminence. So when looking at biochemical testing, you can see firstly that the posterior superior attachment has a lower level of hydration. That would be expected based on seeing a higher proportion of fat vacuoles and hence lower hydration level. And then when looking at collagen, you'll notice collagen is significantly lower by 48.1% in the posterior superior attachment compared to the posterior inferior attachment. And that also follows those strength and stiffness results we saw as well. And then glycosaminoglycans in the lateral disc are 1.48 times and 5.39 times higher compared to the posterior and inferior attachments respectively. And so that supports this notion that the tissues of the TMJ disc complex exist on a spectrum of going from fibrocartilaginous to more fibrofatty. As a more fibrocartilaginous tissue would be expected to have a higher content of glycosaminoglycans, and a more fibrofatty tissue would be expected to have less glycosaminoglycans and also less collagen, which you can see here comparing the attachments to the lateral disc. And then lastly, looking at cross-links assay, you'll notice that the posterior inferior attachment exhibits significantly greater cross-linking for dry weight by 77.8% compared to the posterior superior attachment. That also follows the strength and stiffness results we got in tensile testing. And then cross-linking for collagen, or the degree of cross-linking, also trends higher in the posterior inferior attachment and posterior superior attachment compared to the lateral disc. So that supports this idea of the ligamentous nature of the attachments, because ligaments are known for a high degree of cross-linking. So just in summary, this study definitely cemented the Yucatan mini pig, which has been a well-established model of human TMJ, and has continued to be a good model for us. And we used it to establish design criteria for engineering of the TMJ disc complex successfully. We found that the TMJ disc complex is very anisotropic. The posterior attachments predominantly align mediolaterally, whereas the lateral disc is aligned anterior-posteriorly. And then to address that terminology I had previously mentioned as ligamentous to describe the attachments, the degree of cross-linking trending higher in the posterior attachments compared to the lateral disc, as well as collagen content being higher in the lateral disc compared to the posterior superior attachment, definitely supported this notion of the ligamentous nature of the attachments. Because when we, for example, take the knee, when we compare the cranial and caudal ligaments to the meniscus, the ligaments are higher in the meniscus in the degree of cross-linking, while the meniscus is still more collagenous. So that difference is similar in the attachments. You get the attachments which are higher in the degree of cross-linking, but lower in collagen, which thus it would make sense to term them ligamentous. However, in contrast, we find that the attachments really differ from ligaments in the degree of anisotropy and presence of fat or heterogeneity of the tissues. Ligaments are highly aligned and made up of mainly collagen, whereas you see the attachments are not so highly aligned and also much less collagenous than the disc. And then additionally, despite operating under tension, the tissues we found of the TMJ disc complex transition from fibrocartilage to fibrofatty, as I had mentioned. H&E definitely supported this, showing that different proportion of fat vacuoles going from lateral disc to inferior attachment to superior attachment. And then glycosaminoglycan content also decreased from lateral disc to the attachments, supporting the spectrum of fibrocartilage to more fibrofatty. And then in terms of functionality, we discovered two main functions of the posterior attachments. The first being for the posterior inferior attachment to anchor the disc to the condyle, while the posterior superior attachment seemed to allow translation of the disc condyle unit over the articular eminence. This is mainly supported by the posterior inferior attachment being stiffer, stronger, more collagenous, and more cross-linked compared to the posterior superior attachment, thus supporting this sort of notion of functionality. And then the second main function that we found of the TMJ disc complex is similar to that of a trampoline. While the TMJ disc resists the condyle's compressive stresses under tensile strains, the posterior attachments act as an extension of the TMJ disc in dissipating these compressive loads into tensile loads across the circumference. That's very similar to the way the springs of a trampoline would dissipate the compressive stresses of the trampoline into tensile stresses around the circumference. And that's really supported by the posterior attachments being predominantly aligned and stiffer and stronger in the medial-lateral direction, which is similar to the posterior band of the disc. In other words, it's sort of circumferential alignment, which really supports this sort of spring-like function in the trampoline-like disc. So that's all I have, and I hope that these findings might contribute to our efforts in tissue engineering the TMJ disc complex. Thank you.
Really fantastic presentation. Take some quick questions from the audience here.
Great job, Dr. Hauser.
Not many people get that one.
So,
He doesn't.
I'm an old guy.
I appreciate that the room might find it funny.
It's an old TV show.
Okay.
So you began your excellent presentation by telling us that the TMJ is involved in speaking, chewing, and breathing.
Yeah.
But this medial-lateral alignment of the spring ligament creating a circumferential dissipation of load.
Mm-hmm.
Does that also lead to this being very relevant to the movement of the head and neck?
You're asking how that applies to the movement of the head and neck?
Not necessarily how, but just, I guess, broadening the paradigm of how the TMJ is not just about what the mouth does, but about what the whole upper part of the body does.
I haven't very much studied the rest of the upper, the head and neck and how that relates to the TMJ disc complex and its medial-lateral alignment. I don't know, maybe Ryan has better.
Yeah, as we know, the TMJ it's multifactorial, so it plays in sometimes back pain and things like that can play into the TMJ pain. But yeah, the medial lateral alignment was interesting for us to find, given the primarily AP movement of the joint. But we do find that it helps to the medial lateral alignment is explained by mainly the function of the resistance and compressive stresses under tensile strains, with the posterior attachments acting as an extension of the TMJ disc. Maybe we can chat more offline about it.
So, which do you think deforms more, the superior or the
Sorry, we
inferior?
have just online team here as well.
Thanks for your talk, it's great. I would like to know what your thoughts are, which deforms more, and is there any elastin in the attachments?
Those are two great questions. So in terms of deformity or strain in function, we're suggesting that the posterior superior attachment would deform more as the tissue articulates, and that's supported, we think, by it being a weaker tissue, and thus you'd expect it to deform more, whereas the inferior attachment would kind of anchor more and deform less. And then in terms of elastin, that's a very good question. There's been a few previous characterization studies about the elastin in the attachments. This study didn't at all analyze those, but I don't know, Ryan, can you recall what the elastin is like?
Yeah, so our group has previously done a similar study looking at elastin staining, a biochemical and histologic study of juvenile porcine farm pig tissue. And among these three tissues, the staining looks relatively similar. However, when you look at other attachments in other regions of the disc, there are differences in elastin staining. But to recap, among these three tissues, there don't appear to be significant differences in staining intensity. So, which is interesting given your first question.
What's what was your ramp rate for loading?
Sorry, what's ramp rate?
Oh, like you're in your Instron machine, like your. Was it?
Oh, it was 1% of the gauge, or 0.1% of the gauge.
Okay.
It was
And what is that? How would that affect your, say, yield strength if you increase that?
I'd say we get faster stresses, and the stress strain curve would be heightened if we were to increase the rate of the ramp rate. In this study, we had it at 0.1%, and we got these Young's modulus that I defined earlier. I'm not sure how the stiffness of the tissues, if that's what you're asking, would change if the ramp rate increased.
typically as you increase the strain rate, the tissue gets stiffer, and we are at 1% per second of the
Your
gauge.
yield strength on the lateral ligament could be approximating 10 megapascals, right?
I believe so, yes.
And the medial lateral yield strength on the disc itself is what?
The medial lateral yield strength. You mean the Young's modulus, basically?
No, the yield strength.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was just under 10 megapascals in the AP direction.
How about
And,
medial laterally though?
and much lower medial laterally.
Right, yeah, there's a huge difference between the medial lateral yield strength and the disc compared to the ligament.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
All right, thank you.